This is all that is left of the Kingdom of Congo. These remains show that no matter how powerful your city is, there is always a chance that it will end up in ruins. Now, there is a area right close to here where there is a king who lives and there are sites and cities. And this is what happened to many of the cities in Africa around the entire continent. So the important thing to do to look back is to search for images and writings about these areas. This is from a book from the 1600s, and I'll get back to who wrote it and exactly what they wrote about these different areas. But I want to start off by showing you some of the things that existed in the area. One of them is elephant riding. Now, the person who wrote and drew these images did not himself leave the continent of Europe. This person was a European who wrote about different places around the world from eyewitnesses and drawings that he got. His job was to perfect these drawings. For a while now, I've been reading what he has been saying about Africa, and I will compare also some of the other greatest cities in the world in which he shows and draws them. Something like Nanking, India, Goa, all these places that were very important. Now, a good thing about this is that he gives a historical take and talks about when they were colonized, if they ever were, and when they started trading with the Portuguese, if they ever did. Now remember, this is the 1600s. This means there has been no real colonization in Africa. The only things that exist are really forts in which the Europeans, mainly Portuguese and maybe in some cases French, hide in buildings. So let's just start with Congo and get it out of the way immediately. So as you can see here, this is Sao Salvador, and it is very important that we look at it exactly for what it was. Now remember, I showed you what it is today. It's basically a hill with makeshift houses, well, real houses, but they're not necessarily to the same level that used to be there, the churches and everything. And on looking it is a whole bunch of cities that have replaced the former cities that existed in that area. In the description that is given to Sao Salvador, it mentions 4 places in which they used to be in charge of until they lost their power of it in the 1600s. And that is the Brahmas, Loango, Kakongo, True Congo, and Angola. Now, why does it matter that these kingdoms are here? Well, one, they're mentioned in this very book and they're shown to us. But two, these ones had little to no influence by the Portuguese. And in fact, they were in opposition of the Portuguese. In one of their cases, they actually split because of the Portuguese. He mentions its history, but we will talk about that when we talk about the full narrative of the Kingdom of Congo, which I hope that can be a long video. But then he mentions where these people are situated and who they traded with. And so to the north, the land of the Negroes. These areas, known as the land of the Negroes, he also includes in this book. And this is Guinea and places like that. To the east is Abyssinia. This is another important detail. To the south is Monomotapa and the Kafrate Coast. To the west and the Western Ocean. Now, the limits of these Western Oceans are not necessarily described, although in a later part when they talk about America, when he talks about America, that may come into the conversation. He then gives us the back and the front. So this image that we are seeing here, which is basically you cannot get out or in, this one in black and white, is the back of the Kingdom of Congo. This one in color is the front. This is what the image reconstruction actually looks like of Mbanza, Congo. Now you will notice that it is very difficult to enter this place, and that was built on purpose. It was built so that nobody could enter except from the front and the back, no side, no nothing. This means that warriors would have a hard time coming through. This will come in handy for a king that takes over Mbanza, Congo in the narrative version of this kingdom. But let us move on from Sao Salvador. So in the 1600s, of course, they had already discovered some mummies from ancient Egypt. And this is one of the images drawing the mummies that they had found in Egypt. So let's first start offshore. So Goa is not actually in Africa, it's in Asia, it's actually in India. But I have to mention it because when I mention the parts of Asia, when they start talking about them, he mentions Africa over and over again as a trade partner of these places. This again is going to be very important depending on which areas we're talking about. So let's start with North Africa. So in North Africa, they mention a place called Zara, which is the Sahara Desert. And in this Zara area, they mention three people. One are the Negroes, the Zara Negroes, which we will talk about. And then he mentions Algiers. Now, if you don't know anything about Algiers, it's today not exactly where Algeria is. It's in eastern Tunisia and western Morocco, founded by the pirate Herodin Barbarossa. As you can see with the images, it doesn't look like the most friendly place to be. And this Ottoman, who ended up taking over this area, this Ottoman pirate, he started a regency and brought in many Turks to replace the original populations that were already here. It's safe to say that this region is almost completely out of the reach of the Europeans at this time. In fact, later people saw this place as where Europeans go to die. So, due to the legacy of the people living in Zara or the Sahara, like Tunis and others, you can see here some of the things that they left behind. Now, remember, the Portuguese at this time were also trying to put in things that they can establish for themselves so that they could trade better. But that's a narrative conversation that will come in later. But notice how Tunis and the other place as well are not far off from the Kingdom of Congo, at least not in the interpretation. So, and then there was a place, Tripoli, another place that was taken over by this time. And then there's the Mediterranean Ocean. So we're still talking about Africa. And it's very important to lay this all down because it's not just one image, it's the entire continent to which he had knowledge of that he depicts. By the way, this is not one person's interpretation. This is a fusion of many people around the world who came with maps, who came with drawings, who came with all of that. And then they basically redid them or cleaned them out. So this is the image of Alexandria. This is Egypt, of course, and this is what it must have looked like at the time. Again, pretty impressive, but it's not exactly the biggest standout given some of the cities that we've already looked at, including Mbanza, Congo. This is Cairo, or Caire in the French language, and Caire is founded by the Fatimids in the 10th century. Now, again, this is very important because we're talking about the 10th century. We're talking about the time when not even the earliest Arabs had established anything real in Africa at that time. When I say Africa, I mean the Swahili coast. Now, this is Suakin. It's a city that was founded by Ethiopians or Nubians. These Nubians, and it's still in Sudan today, built one of the greatest cities at the time. Now, in later years, it would fall to the Ottomans. And because it fell to the Ottomans, a lot of people ignore this area because they don't understand that it has a natural history that goes back way far back before the Muslims ever entered this area. And this is the description that this European gives based on what he was told. This town, known by the names Zuakin or Suakim, etc., is situated in a small inlet or gulf, which forms a very good harbor. In the earlier times, Ethiopian Christians embarked from here on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Even today, merchants traveling from Egypt to trade in Abyssinia still use this port. The town has well-built houses. It must be fairly large, as the garrisons usually numbers about 3,000 janissaries under the command of a basha maintained by the Grand Sultan since he made himself master of this place. Now, naturally, you know that a lot of the people who came from this area would also identify as Jews. And since they did, they also did this pilgrimage to the area. And remember that we have a biblical record of this where they said a Jewish man from the kingdom of Candace, the Kandake, went through Egypt and landed in Jerusalem in order to pray. And that's where he converted to Christianity. This is the island of Mozambique, not to be mistaken with the country of Mozambique today. This island first belonged to, firstly, the natives, and then it was colonized by the Kilwan Sultanate, or the Ethiopian Kilwans, who were Muslim, who conquered it for Islam. And then these people of Kilwa lost it in the 1500s. Well, in 1608, they lost it to the Portuguese. This area was so important that it actually was targeted multiple times. The Dutch East India Company was one of its first targets. But if we want to talk about its true history, it was founded by these people. But not only was it founded that way, before these giant forts were put in, these people who lived here continued to live this way even under the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama, Captain General of the fleet of Emmanuel, King of Portugal, discovered Mozambique at the beginning of March 1497. Until then, it had been unknown to the peoples of Europe. The Portuguese gave it the name St. George, which it did not retain. It is built on an island, half a league long, a quarter of a league wide, and about a quarter of the league distance from the mainland. The channel which separates them is not very deep, and it is believed on good grounds that the blows of the sea from some violent tempest detached this island from the continent. It belonged to the king of Kilwa when the Portuguese, considering it a very favorable place for the navigation to India, seized it by force of arms. They had the fortress built there in the year 1508 for the security of their rule and their merchandise. The island is large and well populated, and would be even more so if the air were healthier. The houses are covered with straw and constructed in such a way that the windows face the rising sun and the open sea so as to catch the fresh winds and to have shade as soon as the morning has passed. Now you can see here that they kept the architecture that was already there except for the fort, and they continued this for a very long time until it became obvious that this place would not stand without more fortifications. The name fully given to Mozambique was Mozambique de Zanzibar, or Mozambique of Zanzibar, and this was the typical population found in Zanzibar. The next place he mentions is Socotra. Socotra is this area that today is off the shore of Yemen, even though it's also off the shore of Ethiopia, and it is mainly populated by Arab slash Ethiopian people, but mainly Arab. And this was true during the day as well. Now, in his writings, he especially says that this place is involved in trade with Yemen, India, and Ethiopia. Although this place was something to trade with and definitely had some technologies, it was definitely something to brag about. And it actually helped Ethiopia when it came to going to places like India. So it could be a rest point for them. Next is the mention of Madagascar. And here there's a lot of guesswork because even in his description, he says that men say this about Madagascar. So you can see here that these two people almost look like they belong to two different races, but this is because of reports from Madagascar. In Madagascar, there are two types of people who are explained. One being the Indonesians, called Red Man, because they didn't have a name for them. And then the second being the blacks or the Negroes. Now, the problem with this is that they mix these two because some red men were actually Negroes and some Negroes were quote unquote red men. Now, the people of the Middle East have been coming to this area for a long time, and there is a minority which they saw. They could not penetrate this area as there were several kingdoms already living in this area with several different levels of empires, ranging from cattle herders to empires. Now, before I read this, I must remind you that this place was also penetrated by Genghis Khan's men long time ago who entered here and reported to Marco Polo what they saw. So you can see here it says the Vodrazi, this is a type of people, the largest and wealthiest among the blacks. They are lords of one or more villages and have the privilege of slaughtering cattle belonging to their subject and slaves. The Lohavabits, also great among the blacks, but cannot slaughter a cow or oxen themselves. They must call Rondrian or Anacaradrian to do it. Number three, we'll get back to how accurate this is. Ontfao ranked below the Lahovabits and are their relatives. And then at the bottom, the Ondevas, slaves by birth, brought or captured in war. So basically, what they're trying to show here, even though it's not necessarily accurate, what they're saying is that between these black nations within Madagascar, there was a ranking that was happening. So there's the very rich, then there's the mildly rich, the not so rich, and all of that. And they did not all belong necessarily to the same empire, but they were subject to similar rules. This could be true, even though it's not 100% confirmed, because, like I said again, they did not dare step a foot on this place. One, because obviously the Arabs wanted to protect their communication with these people. And then two, because these people themselves had already been warned about the European powers that were trying to take over. So all of that is fine, but the question would be, where exactly are the Europeans in this map of Madagascar? And you can see that they're throwing in words like incognu as places that they have no idea what's going on. And so this area was basically out of bounds, except for one area, which is called Fort Dauphin or Fort Dolphin. And you can see it right at the bottom. Fort Dauphin was their only real presence in Madagascar. And they were trying their best to try and colonize this area because, of course, what they were hearing about it and how powerful it was, you can imagine the size of this. That place that has the X is where they're at. You can imagine how big the rest of the country was. This is what House Dauphin looked like. Now, here's the thing about House Dauphin. It actually had a weird history. So this is where the colonial people wanted to live. And they lived right at the corners. Remember what Kahindi Andrews said in that debate? They were always at the corners. They never got into the mainlands because war would erupt and they'd be kicked off, including these areas as well. And in this area, someone was melting copper. And what happened? That copper caught flame, and they had to rebuild this entire place once again. As we can read, in 1655, a serious fire occurred when a man, while melting copper in a crucible, carelessly threw it onto dry grass inside the fort. The wind spread the flames. The wind spread the flames, cannons burst, and all bombs and grenades were destroyed. You can imagine what they would have done for their colonial efforts. Now, there are several islands located in that area which they failed to mention. These are just the main important ones that are there, and it's also possible that they just didn't run into the other ones until later, which we do know happened. Some of these islands were not necessarily permanent either. In mainland, they came to South Africa, at that time known as Kafre. There are two areas, so there's Kafre and Ethiopia. Now remember, this is the 1600s, and you can see here there's a fort. This fort is called Fort Chwama, which the natives called Sofala, because generally this area was called Sofala. You can see in the background that there are all kinds of houses. The only thing that the Europeans own here is this one fort, because it is a strategic trade region between the natives, the Kafres, and the Indians. And this is why they set up a fort in this area. Let's zoom in a little bit so that we can see. So you see there in the back, that building in the back belongs to Munamatapa. That one, those buildings in the back belong to the locals who are subject to Munamatapa. And then there are villages all around, which are basically brick cities all around, some belonging to Ethiopians, some belonging to Swahili Coast people, and some belonging to Sofala. So there's a lot of things going on with Sofala, but let's first read what he says, and then I'll tell you the history of this area. So Sofala and the Portuguese fort, this is what he says. Sofala, also called Zefala, was the name of the kingdom traversed by the river called Chwama, which was reputed to carry large quantities of gold in its sands. In the year 1500s, a Portuguese named Guaja built a fort at the mouth of the river, naming it Chwama. After the river itself, however, after the river itself. However, sailors and mariners generally called it Sofala, after the land. The fort was tetragonal, square shaped, and aside from its strategic location, had little else remarkable. Its position was very advantageous for the Portuguese to control trade with India and to facilitate commerce with the local African people, who came to trade ivory, ambergris, gold, and slaves in exchange for hardware, silks, and cloths from Cambe. Now, you might be wondering, Why does it say African people, and why are they talking in past tense? Well, there's a couple reasons. The first reason being that the Portuguese quickly lost this area because of malaria and other diseases they were not used to. This is why they took over Mozambique Island, because it was a little bit easier. They lost the fort. So basically, they built a fort and then the natives took it over because they just couldn't hold it. They kept dying. Now, Sofala has a very interesting history because it starts off with three kingdoms that are fighting for it. The first being the people located in Sofala, the natives of Sofala. The second being the Monomotapa. The Monomotapa first started mining gold in this area. And in fact, the name of this place came from go get or go dig, which means go mine this area. So it was known as an area that had a lot of gold. This place, as mentioned in other places, became only interesting because outside of that, it's not that interesting, only interesting to the people around because it had so much gold. And that's when the Mogadishu, people from Somalia or Ethiopia, Abyssinia, came down and realized that this was there. And these people from Mogadishu made sure to keep it a secret from the Kilwins. The Kilwins, who would eventually discover it later, would also have their hand in this. But all of this ultimately belonged to the king of Monomotapa, the Monomotapa. And that was just it for the longest time until later when the Monomotapa would fall in much later years. The Portuguese couldn't hold it, although they liked the gold, but they had to just work as middlemen between this local area and India, making the Monomotapa still rich, even when the Portuguese had already entered this area. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the people in the mainland, they just had to hear about them. They had no idea who these people were. They knew about the names, maybe one or two Arabs had told them about him, and maybe one European person had seen the buildings, but never had they really penetrated. So, if you remember, there are five places that were conquered by the Kingdom of Congo, but they lost them before the Portuguese ever got there. And these were the Brahmas, the Luanga, the Kakongo, the True Congo or the Inner Congolese, and Angola. Now, this is Luango. Now, if you remember, Alfred Dapper also talked about Luango and he mentioned the many streets, the many houses, the roads, paved roads, which again is something that we need to keep in mind as I continue to make videos. Because remember, these roads, they would be eaten by the civilization. And if we zoom in to this image of Luango, we can actually see that it's a fairly busy city. If you look at the back, if you look around, and it is huge, fortified, a great place. Now, remember, as I mentioned, Alfred Dapper is another person who wrote about this place, and it shows that the Kingdom of Congo, which this is not part of it, but this place used to be part of it, was already built up, as a lot of the areas that used to belong to it but are separate from it are still established by this time and are represented by stone walls and stone houses. A map provided speaks to the complications or the complexity of this area. As you can see, surrounded by the bird is Congo. And as you go down, it's Biafra, Capons. If you go down, it's the Brahmas. These are the people they couldn't capture. Luango, right under the line there. Then you go to Kakongo. This is that other place he couldn't conquer. If you keep going down, you see Zaire, all these other places. Then you see right at the bottom, Monomotapa. To the left, Abyssinia. And then you can see Borno at the top. And as you go up, you go to the Zara Desert. Nubia, you can see to the side. So this place was a very busy area, and the neighbors were not just neighbors for no reason. Just like the Portuguese, they actually had people located inside the Kingdom of Congo who acted as merchants or communicators with these people. This is how they knew that Europeans were coming before they even got there, because they allowed people from other kingdoms to come in small amounts, which they tried to do with Angola. But then the Angola people thought that these merchants coming from Congo were spies and got rid of them all. Of course, he goes through the image of Congo, the back and the front, and then he shows the people of Congo and what they look like. So you've probably seen this image before. This image is an image of Dom Afonso. Dom Afonso was the king of Congo, and as the king of Congo, he continued to mix the Portuguese and the African styles together. But that's not just one thing that was important. The other thing that was important about Dom Afonso is that he set up a thing where the Portuguese could live in Pemba, a place in uh, Congo, and he put them in a very small location. And the numbers of the Portuguese were never exceeded 100 in that area. The Portuguese, of course, waged war against Angola at one point because Angola refused to be part of the Portuguese. Although Angola remained independent for a longer time, they did lose one of their most important people who was acting as a fighter. So it says here the kingdom of Angola had its own king who, having displeased the Portuguese in the year 1667, was waged war upon, taken prisoner, and his head sent salted to Lisbon in 1668. During this time, the author was there. Luango and Anziku also had their own kings. The Portuguese occupied San Salvador in the province of Pemba, Masengano, and Cambambe in the kingdom of Angola, and Sao Paulo on the island of Luanda. So let me put that in context. So I've shown this with Luanda that they had a small ownage over there. They had Sao Paulo as well. This is close to the 1700s, everything that's happening here. Uh, Kambambe as well, they had a piece of it. The province of Pemba, they were granted by the Portuguese occupied San Salvador in the province of Pemba. So they were granted that permission by the king. So, when referring to the people of the entire area, so from Angola to Congo, he mentions the several different types of people there, and he calls this the torrid zone. So, of course, the torrid zone is supposed to be now the area where the sun is not that harsh, therefore, people can live there. And he says, the people there have very dark skin, extremely flat noses, short and curly hair, and their faces are often disfigured by smallpox, which is very common. A small number have olive colored skin and red hair. Now, this is the part that confuses a lot of historians because this could mean two things. The first one is the Khoisan red hair. The olive skin clearly comes from Khoisan. That we know. So he is they are talking about the olive skin of the Khoisan people, and then they're talking about the red hair. The red hair could be due to sun bleaching or sunbathing, which is a thing that happens to afro textured hair when it's been exposed too long to the sun. So to prove that he's talking about a little bit of a different population than the main one, he says, and these are considerably extremely strong smelling. So he's talking about the Khoisan, and again, he has no experience with these people, but he says they are considered. Although one of the explanations is that they're talking about the Khoisans, it is possible that they are talking about the Himba, and the red hair actually refers more to the hair, clay hair, that they put on. No matter who he was talking about, he clearly separates the dark from the light. Today, you cannot tell because people from these regions are mixed with Khoisan deeply, and so people can vary from dark to light whether they're Bantu or not. Although the Khoisan are still significantly lighter than most people. This is the island of St. Helena, and it has a very interesting history, but I will just read it as the Portuguese explained it themselves. The kings of Portugal neglected to fortify the island, fearing that during a long voyage sailors might desert and settle there. They treated it merely as an asylum for the sick sailors, sending a hermit to reside there temporarily. The hermit later left, preferring the pleasure of hunting over caring over a chapel and the sick. Later, two Africans and a Javanese islander, Indonesian, who had escaped from Portuguese ships with two women, took refuge on the island. Their numbers grew to about 20 people, and they made their retreat in apparently inaccessible rocks from which they would suddenly attack and kill sick Portuguese sailors. So, this is the mythology behind St. Helena and the people who occupied it. Now, as interesting as that story is, it is possible that the reason why this island was colonized was because the people of Indonesia already knew routes past the Cape of Good Hope and might be connected to the whole story that Albuquerque told. This could possibly also link them to South America. Ignoring St. Helena, we continue upwards with Africa. He then explains Guinea. Now, if the Cafre areas had too many kingdoms, then this area has way more than that. For example, he gives us Walata, Agadez, Bornu, Gwangara, Zanfara, Zegzeg, Gago, Subs, Bakemba, Mandinka, Jolofs, Fauli, the Fulani, Genoa, Gunau, Tambut, Timbuktu, Kanu, Kaslena, Bangana, Vindingai, Kontori, Gambaya. These are all considered independent states, although there are a couple that fall under. For example, Walata, Agadez, and the others are part of the greater Tumbut areas. So it further explains that this area is owned by three people: the Jolofs, the Tumbut or the Timbuktu people, and the Bornu or Kanem Bornu. Interestingly, he chooses Zawagani being as a representative of the Negroes, but he is actually a king of the Jolofs. Now, if we look at this map, all of these people are located just below the Zara or the Sahara. And you can see there Bornu, Zanfara, Nubia, Bangana, Guinea, Gualata, all of them shown here. Now, interestingly, almost all the parts about Africa, he has been depicting it in pictures more than words. But as you start to get close to Zara and this Guinea region, he makes it very word heavy. And we're going to talk about that another time. But I will leave you with this image. It is an image of two Ethiopians or two Negroes atop of elephants, and they are from the Zara Desert, and they represent some of the groups that have already been provided by other authors, such as the Berber tribes, which they call the Negroes of the Zara. Now, just because I'm done doesn't mean he's done, as he will continue to discuss the other tribes of Negroes which he didn't mention, like the Nubians, for example. The Abyssinians are another one. The Abyssinians, of course, of the highlands, the Monomotapa kingdom. He saves these all for last, including Morocco.